is a big question about how effective the vice president has been able to be, because there is this issue of credibility when it comes to the White House, and there is this issue of knowing what Trump actually wants. And that's really what Republican senators have been saying, that they will put forward anything that the president will sign, but they have to have something that he'll sign. And they're not quite sure how to navigate this, because just because Pence says something in a meeting doesn't necessarily mean that the president is on the same page. And as we know from covering this president, that he can say one thing in the morning and a different thing in the afternoon. So I think this issue of how powerful the vice president is, I think, is a really big question. And we just haven't seen much evidence yet of him being able to corral these folks.
It's been interesting, too, because we have not heard, Caitlin, from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
Right.
And it's been fascinating because in the past, of course, he's one of those voices that you definitely would have heard.
Absolutely, particularly in the past administration. What's very interesting, too, is that Mitch McConnell is saying, look, remember the night that the government shut down, he basically said, look, we're not going to play these games. We're just going to wait to see what the president wants to do. And that's really been his approach. He also knows that even though Republicans have a majority in the Senate, they don't have a supermajority. They still need Democrats to come on board for anything, to meet that threshold to get anything passed. And he also knows that now Nancy Pelosi is the House Speaker in charge of the Democrats. That it's a very different dynamic for all these major players involved.
So, Antoine, let me ask you, because we heard the vice president say that this could be resolved in a matter of hours if Democrats come to the table. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely not. Democrats have been at the table from day one. That's why you saw the bipartisan effort pass out of the Senate just before the Christmas break to say, you know what, let's do what we should do from a legislative perspective, but let's not hold the government hostage or governmental workers hostage. But the role of the vice president and Senator McConnell, to your point, Senator McConnell has been burned more than one time by this president when it comes to legislation. As we say in the South, there's no education in the second kick of the mule. If you remember,
wait, let me just absorb that. There's no education in the second kick of the mule. Okay, so translate. What does that mean
so that
to
means
this situation?
If I've been burned before, I'm not going to go back again and be burned twice.
He's been burned before.
Absolutely, yes. And you can pick one issue or the other. He's been burned. And remember, there was a bipartisan bill by Graham and Durbin last year brought to the president per his request. You bring me something that will pass the Senate, I will sign. It was killed. A second bill by the late Senator John McCain, bipartisan bill to deal with immigration, it was killed. And so we see this ongoing effort, and it was very telling from the Republican standpoint. And my friends on the Hill who work for the Republican caucus, we laugh about this. McConnell left the press conference last week and left the press conference after their negotiations on Saturday. So that shows his posture. What he also knows as the majority leader, his job is to hold the caucus together. And he cannot do that if he starts to lose members one by one.
So, I mean, Leslie, what's the strategy here on the part of the president and Republicans? I mean, is this about 2020?
I think Pence would like to know.
Yeah.
You know, this would be really interesting. You know, I just say I keep seeing this characterization of the vice president is like Charlie Brown in the football. Like, no matter how hard he tries to sell this message or do what the president wants, it's always very pained. It changes at the last minute, and you just never, you know, he just never executes the way I think the president wants him to. Internally or externally, I think they'll give a lot of applause and praise to the vice president, but it's a very thankless job in terms of navigating what the president wants to do when he's isolated and siloed himself. And really, he's the only one that knows the strategy and the playbook. But in many accounts, I wouldn't discount the president. That's what I think McConnell knows. McConnell knows is that the president knows how to win, especially in these really mano-a-mano battles. And on this issue, I think his political gut says to hold the line on this wall, even if it's manufactured in many ways. This is the idea of the whole wall, how's it put together. He doesn't want to get into those details. He wants to talk more about this kind of broad brushstroke win and keep the pressure on the Democrats to look like they're open amnesty, open border, and contrast that. And if not, it becomes the detonation issue for 2020, something that galvanizes the entire party.
So, you know, Caitlin, you're going to have the president meeting with congressional leaders tomorrow. What is that about, potentially, here?
Well, they have to strike some kind of deal to reopen the government. And as we were talking about before, tonight is, in some ways, a way to message to the public and make the case to the public, the president, for why he's holding firm on the border wall. It's outs also, as we discussed, to really speak to his core base of support and saying, look, I'm fighting for you from the Oval Office in prime time. I think that's an important message that he's sending. But tomorrow is, again, back to the drawing board here. And I think it's really important to note that Democrats have a rebuttal tonight. That just goes to show that they are not really operating on the same page at this point. They still hold very different views about how to move forward. You have the president who feels like he has a mandate from his campaign in 2016. You now have Democrats who feel they have a mandate from their campaign and their takeover of the House in 2018. So these are two sides who are very opposed to one another, who are trying to win their own PR battles. And so I think tomorrow is really kind of the practical work of how do we get to something that will reopen the government. The thing that I'm watching, too, just really quickly, is for some of these Republican senators who have said that they're on board with Trump and they want something that they can sign, what is the public pressure like in their districts or in their states coming as the shutdown keeps going forward and as more and more workers are experiencing the actual effects of the furloughs?
Antoine, you want to say something?
And what we saw from the last midterms is that when certain members hitch their wagon to Trump, they go down. And I think the 2020 Republicans, particularly Susan Collins, Democrats won in Oklahoma, that strikes fear, political fear in them. So that's why you see them saying, you know what? I'm going to do what I have to do to reopen the government because I don't want this to be attached to me and my record when I'm up for re-election in 2020. Now, here's where I caution my Democratic friends, and I said this to Mr. Clyburn earlier today. We have to be one band, one sound. Meaning, while it may be nice and it may be politically cute for 3 or 4 people to give a rebuttal, but at the end of the day, if we get off message and we get off the idea of holding this administration accountable and this Republican Congress accountable for shutting down the government, we get in trouble. I saw this with my own clear eyes when the immigration issue, when parents were being ripped from their children, and it was on the Trump administration because of their policies. We had Democrats going off the wall saying we need to abolish ICE, and the messaging was lost in the shuffle. And so the American voter did not see the Trump policy. They saw Democrats want to talk about abolishing ICE, and that's the danger for us in our party. And I'm here to tell them we have too much at stake in 2020 for us not to be one band, one sound.
I mean, are we already seeing that? Because you're having multiple Democratic responses tonight.
Well, see, and that's my fear, because you know what? What Republicans will do, they will say, you know what? Let's take one sound bite from this person, and let's make that the campaign commercial, campaign radio spot in 2020, when the message clear cut has been from Pelosi and Schumer. We're not going to give you the wall. We'll do border security. We'll open the government, and we'll negotiate comprehensive immigration reform. And when we start playing cute ball and not playing hardball, that's when we lose.
I mean, is that something, Leslie, then that Republicans will look to obviously capitalize on if there's any kind of perception of daylight between some of these Democrats?
I think they love the idea of Schumer Pelosi together. I mean, that's just like the perfect ticket for Republicans. You couldn't ask for anything better.
Galvanizing
it's
for
like, thank you
Republicans.
so much
right.
for the gift. It's a late Christmas present, but for Republicans, for Trump particularly, it's fantastic because there's nothing that unites the Republicans more than seeing those two together. Because it represents a lot of the same thing to the Republican Party. But I find it fascinating because I want to go back to the issue that Kayla was talking about. Well, what is that wall? We talk a lot about building the wall, border wall. But if you ask the voters, especially in different states, in battleground states and states that really matter, even if you talk about America's heartland, which is kind of the Great Plains and the central part of the country, it means different things. Like, is it the financial aspect that they have a problem with the wall, $5 billion? Because when you ask people about numbers like that, they don't necessarily, it doesn't have a context to people because it's just like, okay,
right, it's hard to get your head around that, frankly.
Nobody understands. They don't have that in their bank account unless you're, on the West and East Coast. There's a lot more of those people nowadays. But in kind of the heartland of America, it means a different thing. Or is it the moral responsibility, to be compassionate to the people who are coming here to work? Or is it, again, an economic issue where they see too many people coming that are working and taking shortcuts and not being fair to a process, the rule of law argument. So it does mean different things. And Anthony Salvanto was talking a little bit about that. If you break down those numbers of the wall, okay, 59% don't support it. But if you get into, and more Republicans obviously do, get into some of those swing areas, you'll find it lines up with where they feel immigration is important. If they feel immigration is important, they're going to support the president of the wall. And for the president, that's a winning strategy in 2020.
So if this shutdown continues into the weekend, it's going to be, Caitlin, the longest shutdown in our history. Is it clear who might get the blame then?
Well, the president thinks that he has his supporters on his side and he believes he's doing the right thing for them. But Democrats really do feel like they have public opinion. They're pointing to polls like the CBS poll that was in November after the midterms, saying that, nearly 60% of people oppose the wall. But again, to Leslie's point, that was on partisan lines. Republicans were very supportive of it. Democrats were very opposed to it when we're talking about the wall. You've also heard the president talk a lot about, well, the government is all, the government workers are all Democrats anyway, and they'll blame the Democrats. And, what this, and I know you've done some reporting on this, what people think about the government is different, as you've mentioned before. And then you have Democrats who feel like they just got off an election in which they saw the president out campaigning across the country, talking about a crisis at the border, talking about the need for a wall. And Democratic voters and some independents really turned against Republicans and voted Democrats into the House. So competing audiences here. And that's what the dynamic is moving forward.
Yeah.
Throughout this process, the one consistent tune coming from the Trump choir is this is a red issue for his base. When you look at the 2020 Dems who are up for election and the political pressure is starting to get higher, in my opinion, what that means is Trump wants to jack up the enthusiasm among the people who have to come out for him and them. And that's why you see this uptick in the pressure. That's why you see this. But what the president cannot run away from as it relates to shutdown is the fact that he owned the shutdown in the very beginning.
That soundbite in the
and that
office
soundbite will ring true all across this country in 2020 the longer this thing drags out. And so for Democrats, it's like, you know what? Go tell it on the mountain, go tell it on the hills, go tell it everywhere. It's the Trump shutdown.
Others, his supporters might argue, though, that, he is sort of Teflon and things don't necessarily stick to him in the way that they have stuck to other people. So, that's debatable. That's for another time. Let's take a quick break here. Caitlin, Leslie, and Antoine, thank you so much. Okay, not a break. All right, all 9 members of Congress who represent districts along the U.S.-Mexico border are opposed to funding for a wall. That's according to new reporting up now on CBSNews.com. Earlier, my colleague Rena Ninan spoke with one of those congressmen, Arizona Democrat Raul Grijalva, about the president's upcoming speech and the current fight over the border wall.
President Trump says that he's doing tonight's speech to talk about, quote, the humanitarian and national security crisis on our southern border. Do you believe there's a crisis at the border?
Yeah, it's no coincidence that all the elected officials, including Republican colleagues, have opposed this wall, opposed the intervention that Trump is talking about, and all state that this is a manufactured crisis and a crisis that manufactured by the Trump administration. So now we find him giving a speech today that is self-fulfilling. It's look how terrible things are. This is what I have to do. And I think all of this is unnecessary. And if there is a crisis on the border, it is one of confidence that this country can do anything, that can do anything to find a solution. And more importantly, it's a crisis of for the economy and the well-being of that border region as a whole. It is a terrible, terrible mistake that Trump is making, insisting on a wall that Mexico will not pay for and that the Democrats at this point are not going to fund.
Mexico, you says, will not pay for it. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said she would give the president a single dollar for a border wall. Is there any amount of funding that you would support?
Well, the funding has been there. There's been discussion about funding that deals with security issues without interjecting the idea of a political promise, which is the wall. Everybody agrees security is critical. We know it's important. We're aware of the organized crime on both sides of the border that use that as their passage point for drugs, weapons, etc., and human smuggling. So yeah, it has to. That's an issue. But this wall, this fantasy, this political promise that it was inane when he made it, and it continues to be inane, is not the solution. It doesn't even approach a solution.
You know, there's a shutdown in Washington. How do you approach fixing the solution? You know very well about the border wall and the situation at the border. What's your solution, sir, to fix this?
I think the approach has to be comprehensive. I think we need to put energy, time, and resources into our ports of entry, where 60% of all apprehensions and confiscating of illegal substances is made, and also promotes the ebb and flow of commerce, trade, and visitation. That's where both the security and economic question lie, and we are ignoring that. We're ignoring fully funding customs and the personnel that's needed there. And then I think you have to understand that this crisis, whether it was a children's separation, whether it is the horrible conditions that are going on in detention, the for-profit centers, whether it is the misguided wall comments that the president make, is all to satisfy, try to satisfy 25% of the American public that wants this wall. I think he is wrong politically, and in terms of strategic, in terms of security, absolutely wrong.
Well, the president will have the spotlight this afternoon, and then shortly after this evening, and then after that, Nancy Pelosi, House Speaker, and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer will also then have a chance to speak after the president tonight. Are they the right people to come forward and push forward the Democratic response?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think we have to stay that we're solution focused, and that there are solutions to the border, and that we need to explore them. We need to have a debate on this issue with the same set of facts, not manufactured facts that Trump is going to present tonight. And whether or not he declares it an emergency, it is something that I know his advisors, Miller, the most prominent, are encouraging him to do, to declare a state of emergency, which is both illegal and devastating to the district that I represent.
Back in August, you had actually called for the resignation of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. Do you still believe that to be the case? And if so, what are the grounds that you say she's unfit for this job? I think the data that has been presented and what he's got, the litany of things that he's going to read tonight, are one misstatement, one lie after another. The situation on the border requires our attention. There's an urgency to it. People need to feel secure. But what he is going about in demonizing the whole region, demonizing people, using bigotry, and using a phony promise of wall is not the solution. And I hope that Nielsen realizes that, and the American public continues to support something rational and sane. Congressman, while I have you here, I know you just took over as chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. Several of your Democratic colleagues have called for a Green New Deal to reshape the U.S. economy. It'll be around clean jobs. Is that something you would support?
Yes, it does. I think that the transition is more than, we started a transition to look toward the future, to deal with the very real issue of climate change. That was abandoned by the Trump administration 2 years ago. We need to get back to dealing with long-term solutions, and that includes the promoting of a green economy, less carbon emissions into our atmosphere, and and using science and fact as the basis for our decision making. I hope we can take those steps this year.
Are you confident you'd have Republican support for those initiatives?
Well, I think at this point it's the House has to do its business, and then if it goes to the Senate, then the Senate will have to do what they need to do. But from the House perspective, I think we need to set a template for the American people that we're not going to idly sit by, that we're going to take action, and it's going to be bold, and it's going to be necessary action. And if the president doesn't want to sign legislation, or the Senate refuses to act on it, it's to their own consequences that they do that, because I think the American public is behind us.
Arizona Democratic Congressman Raul Grijalva, thank you very much, Congressman, for joining us.
Thank you, Ina. Appreciate it.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more of our special coverage of President Trump's first Oval Office address to the nation, including a chat with an official from the union that represents those furloughed TSA workers. You're streaming CBS News, always on. As the partial government shutdown continues for a third week, the impact is beginning to be felt. One of the agencies most affected is the Transportation Security Administration. TSA officers at airports around the country are required to work through the government shutdown. They're not currently being paid. Many of them have been calling out sick, bringing into question the safety of air travel. Scott Robinson is the local president of the American Federation of Government Employees, Local 448. He joins me from Norfolk, Virginia. Scott, thanks so much for being with us.
Absolutely.
So just how much of an impact is this partial government shutdown having on our airports and air travel?
Well, it's having a significant impact on the screening workforce, of course. We are our country's first line of defense when it comes to air travel, and being required to work without pay is simply unacceptable.
Well, how, if at all, is this affecting security at the airports?
Well, it definitely affects morale, and in that way, it affects the effectiveness of our officers' ability to focus on their duties.
Well, there's been a steady uptick of TSA officers calling in sick to work as the shutdown continues. Do you foresee that being a problem as long as the government remains closed?
I do not. I believe that our officers are professional, and I believe that they are dedicated to their job. And you have to keep in mind also that we're in flu season, so it may simply be coincidental.
Well, what are you hearing from union members? How is the shutdown affecting them personally?
Well, many of our officers are living paycheck to paycheck. We have many who are single parents, or they are, if they are in a relationship, they're in a single income household where they have, say, two officers working.
And if this lasts any
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you have two officers working together. Mm-hmm. So it is significantly distressing to those individuals.
Well, if this lasts any longer, is the union in a position to provide financial assistance?
I can't speak for the union as a national unit. However, our local is looking towards offering food banking opportunities and providing meals and whatnot, staple items to ensure that our officers can make it through this.
All right, Scott Robinson. Scott, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And for more, I want to bring in CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns, CBS News contributor and Republican strategist Leslie Sanchez, and Antoine Seawright, CEO and founder of Blueprint Strategy and an advisor to the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. All right, so very quickly in the minutes that we have left before the president speaks, what are you going to be listening for tonight, Caitlin, from both the president and the Democrats?
Well, first of all, I want to know if either of them says anything new, if the president provides any kind of evidence that has been lacking so far in his claims of a border crisis. And I also want to hear from Democrats, or also looking to hear from Democrats, I should say, anything new, any ground they're willing to cede or not. And also, I think there is going to be some questions to Democrats about what they want to see in terms of border security. If not a wall, then what? And I think that's an opportunity for them to talk as well.
Oh, what do you think, Leslie? What are you going to keep an eye on?
Listening for how he's building the case for a national emergency, built on what, and as much as everybody's going to be diving into the details and see just how many what alternative facts the president may put forward, I think the bigger issue is what is going to be. You're already seeing conservative organizations saying border for DACA. For conservatives to be arguing for DACA, I've just never seen anything.
Remarkable.
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
For conservatives to say, and Republicans to be saying, we want comprehensive reform that includes legalization. When did they ever talk about things like that?
They've always used amnesty to describe that.
No,
right?
Absolutely. So is this really a way for the president to push the issue and get reforms that no one thought were going to, they were never done under the Democrats. It would never have been done because of the conservative right. And now we're actually having a strong conversation. So as much as people keep talking about blame for the president, some people are going to be talking about credit.
And what are you listening for, Antoine?
What I want to hear and what I expect to hear are two totally different things. What I want to hear is the president really apologize to the 800,000 plus federal workers. He's the chief executive of this country. The buck stops with him. I want to hear an apology from him on that regard. I also want him to hear from him his case of why we cannot open the federal government up and then work on border security, a wall, whatever the issue may be, because I think that's confusing for most people who are outside the bubble. Now, what I expect to hear from him is red meat campaign rhetoric from his comfort zone to his base to get them fired up and ready to go, so that when he goes to Congress to make the case, they'll be flooded with emails, text messages, Facebook messages about stand firm, and then he goes to the border the next day and he'll continue to make the public relations case for his version of why we are in this crisis. And I also expect him to say that because of this quote-unquote crisis, he needs to take executive action immediately.
But to Leslie's point, do you think there's also an opportunity here, if enough pressure is put on both sides, that there could actually be some kind of movement on this intractable issue of immigration?
I think where you will find movement is to reopen the government. I think that's a pretty solid consensus among the legislative branch, not the executive, legislative branch. Now, what I hope to hear from Democrats is a message of unity. One band, one sound. No one-offs, no let me get cute, no I'm not running for 2020. But let's stay focused on what the American people are hungry and thirsty for, and that's reopening the government and addressing this issue called immigration as a whole. That's what I hope to hear from them, not taking shots at the president. We don't win when we fight against Donald Trump. We win when we fight for what the American people want.
We only have about a minute left, but very quickly, Caitlin, there's been some debate over whether or not the media should be covering this address. But it occurs to me we're coming off a holiday season when people have been busy, frankly, doing other things and perhaps not paying attention to sort of the granular details of this debate. What does this present in terms of an opportunity of informing people who maybe have had other things on their radar regarding this issue?
Well, I think first it's an opportunity for both sides now, of course, to make their case. And, we are in, this several days into this, almost the longest shutdown. You're starting to have people who are actually feeling the effects now, particularly on the economic front. So I think it's that case. And also, I think it's an opportunity for news organizations like us to also provide, while all eyes are on this, aggressive fact-checking and reporting, which is what we have been doing.
All right. Caitlin, Leslie, and Antoine, thank you so much. In just a moment, the President of the United States will address the nation from the Resolute desk, something that happens rarely and carries with it the weight of the Oval Office. You will hear President Trump speak. You'll hear the response from Democrats afterwards. We will examine what was said and report the facts with the context to understand them. We'll have analysis from our panel of experts, and we will dig into the claims made by both Democrats and Republicans, plus a look at how the country sees the scene at the border and the partial government shutdown. That is all ahead in our extended coverage on CBSN. And right now, we want to take you to a CBS News special report.
This is a CBS News Special Report. I'm Jeff Glor. President Trump is about to deliver his first address from the Oval Office to make his case for a border wall on day 18 of the partial government shutdown. Out of roughly 2 million federal workers, 800,000 are impacted. About half are furloughed. Half are required to work without pay right now. The wall is at the heart of this dispute. Building it was a key campaign promise. The president says he will not sign any spending bill that does not include more than $5 billion for wall construction. Democrats have said no. Neither side has budged. In laying out his case, the president will contend there's a crisis at the southern border brought on by a surge of families and unaccompanied minors from Central America seeking asylum. He has also floated the idea of declaring a national emergency to get around Congress and force construction of a wall. CBS News is told right now the president is not expected to do that. The president is planning to visit the border on Thursday. A recent CBS News poll taken before the shutdown found that 59% of Americans oppose a border wall. Among Democrats, 84% oppose it. Among Republicans, 79% favor it. After the president speaks, we will hear from top Democrats, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. We also hope to fact-check any inaccurate assertions. But here now is the president.
My fellow Americans, tonight I am speaking to you because there is a growing humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. Every day, Customs and Border Patrol agents encounter thousands of illegal immigrants trying to enter our country. We are out of space to hold them, and we have no way to promptly return them back home to their country. America proudly welcomes millions of lawful immigrants who enrich our society and contribute to our nation. But all Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal migration. It strains public resources and drives down jobs and wages. Among those hardest hit are African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. In the last 2 years, ICE officers made 266,000 arrests of aliens with criminal records, including those charged or convicted of 100,000 assaults, 30,000 sex crimes, and 4,000 violent killings. Over the years, thousands of Americans have been brutally killed by those who illegally entered our country, and thousands more lives will be lost if we don't act right now. This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart, and a crisis of the soul. Last month, 20,000 migrant children were illegally brought into the United States, a dramatic increase. These children are used as human pawns by vicious coyotes and ruthless gangs. 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted on the dangerous trek up through Mexico. Women and children are the biggest victims, by far, of our broken system. This is the tragic reality of illegal immigration on our southern border. This is the cycle of human suffering that I am determined to end. My administration has presented Congress with a detailed proposal to secure the border and stop the criminal gangs, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. It's a tremendous problem. Our proposal was developed by law enforcement professionals and border agents at the Department of Homeland Security. These are the resources they have requested to properly perform their mission and keep America safe, in fact, safer than ever before. The proposal from Homeland Security includes cutting-edge technology for detecting drugs, weapons, illegal contraband, and many other things. We have requested more agents, immigration judges, and bed space to process the sharp rise in unlawful migration fueled by our very strong economy. Our plan also contains an urgent request for humanitarian assistance and medical support. Furthermore, we have asked Congress to close border security loopholes so that illegal immigrant children can be safely and humanely returned back home. Finally, as part of an overall approach to border security, law enforcement professionals have requested $5.7 billion for a physical barrier. At the request of Democrats, it will be a steel barrier rather than a concrete wall. This barrier is absolutely critical to border security. It's also what our professionals at the border want and need. This is just common sense. The border wall would very quickly pay for itself. The cost of illegal drugs exceeds $500 billion a year, vastly more than the $5.7 billion we have requested from Congress. The wall will also be paid for indirectly by the great new trade deal we have made with Mexico. Senator Chuck Schumer, who you will be hearing from later tonight, has repeatedly supported a physical barrier in the past, along with many other Democrats. They changed their mind only after I was elected president. Democrats in Congress have refused to acknowledge the crisis, and they have refused to provide our brave border agents with the tools they desperately need to protect our families and our nation. The federal government remains shut down for one reason, and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security. My administration is doing everything in our power to help those impacted by the situation. But the only solution is for Democrats to pass a spending bill that defends our borders and reopens the government. This situation could be solved in a 45-minute meeting. I have invited congressional leadership to the White House tomorrow to get this done. Hopefully, we can rise above partisan politics in order to support national security. Some have suggested a barrier is immoral. Then why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? They don't build walls because they hate the people on the outside, but because they love the people on the inside. The only thing that is immoral is the politicians to do nothing and continue to allow more innocent people to be so horribly victimized. America's heart broke the day after Christmas when a young police officer in California was savagely murdered in cold blood by an illegal alien who just came across the border. The life of an American hero was stolen by someone who had no right to be in our country. Day after day, precious lives are cut short by those who have violated our borders. In California, an Air Force veteran was raped, murdered, and beaten to death with a hammer by an illegal alien with a long criminal history. In Georgia, an illegal alien was recently charged with murder for killing, beheading, and dismembering his neighbor. In Maryland, MS-13 gang members who arrived in the United States as unaccompanied minors were arrested and charged last year after viciously stabbing and beating a 16-year-old girl. Over the last several years, I've met with dozens of families whose loved ones were stolen by illegal immigration. I've held the hands of the weeping mothers and embraced the grief-stricken fathers. So sad, so terrible. I will never forget the pain in their eyes, the tremble in their voices, and the sadness gripping their souls. How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job? To those who refuse to compromise in the name of border security, I would ask, imagine if it was your child, your husband, or your wife whose life was so cruelly shattered and totally broken. To every member of Congress, pass a bill that ends this crisis. To every citizen, call Congress and tell them to finally, after all of these decades, secure our border. This is a choice between right and wrong, justice and injustice. This is about whether we fulfill our sacred duty to the American citizens we serve. When I took the oath of office, I swore to protect our country, and that is what I will always do. So help me God. Thank you and good night.
Okay, that was the president speaking, addressing the nation from the Oval Office. In just a moment, we will hear the Democrats' response. We'll go to that as soon as they come up. Our team is following all of this. Major Garrett is at the White House, Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill, and Ed O'Keefe joins me here on set in New York City. Major, the president says the crisis of heart and crisis of the soul. What'd you make of it?
But not a crisis sufficient, Jeff, to justify a national emergency and go around Congress to take money from the Pentagon and build part of a border wall, something the president has hinted about publicly for the better part of the last 4 days, and this administration is still toying with. So it may be a crisis, it may be an emergency, but the president is still going to leave the legislative process for now alone to see if a negotiated settlement can be reached. Essentially a speech in two parts. The first part about the broad humanitarian crisis, so-called by the president. The second part about Americans suffering at the hands of illegal, undocumented immigrants and the crime linked to them. Jeff?
All right, Major, thanks very much. Dealing with a couple microphone issues there at the White House. So let's go over to Nancy Cordes right now, who was on Capitol Hill. Nancy, what are we about to hear from Democrats?
Well, they will argue, Jeff, that the president is manufacturing a crisis and exaggerating the numbers, that the number of illegal border crossings is actually way down over the past 10 years, and that while they want to put money into border security, a wall is simply a 13th century solution to a 21st century problem. And they know that privately many Republicans agree with them, and that's why they are holding firm. They believe that the longer this drags on, the more Republicans they will be able to peel off, because many Republicans were never as passionate about this wall as the president was, but they've been sticking with him out of party loyalty. But as this goes on day after day, there are more and more federal workers, and every member of Congress is hearing from them, getting those calls from people who are wondering when they'll get paid, when they'll get their food stamps, and when they'll get housing assistance.
All right, Nancy, thanks very much. Major, is there a sense of how firmly or not Republicans are holding together?
Well, the vice president has been calling Republicans, particularly those in the House, asking them to hold the line with the president. The president and the vice president are going to meet with congressional senators tomorrow at their policy luncheon to hold the line there. The White House still believes that the vast majority of Republicans in the Senate and the House will hold the line. But as Nancy just indicated, House Democrats will put legislation on the floor of the House this week and next that will probably divide Republican ranks and provide opportunities to open up certain parts of the government. There will be a behind-the-scenes effort here at the White House to keep those Republican defections to an absolute minimum. But there are those already here at the White House who imagine this thing playing out for weeks and Republicans possibly breaking ranks and the president having to veto something he doesn't support, and then we get into a veto override situation where Republican decisions about sticking with the president or not will be very dire indeed.
Major, thanks. Interesting to hear the president refer to this as a, quote, physical barrier. He said a steel barrier per a Democrat's request. Here's Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly to the American people tonight about how we can end this shutdown and meet the needs of the American people. Sadly, much of what we heard from President Trump throughout this senseless shutdown has been full of misinformation and even malice. The president has chosen fear. We want to start with the facts. The fact is, on the very first day of this Congress, House Democrats passed Senate Republican legislation to reopen government and fund smart, effective border security solutions. But the president is rejecting these bipartisan bills, which would reopen government, over his obsession with forcing American taxpayers to waste billions of dollars on an expensive and ineffective wall, a wall he always promised Mexico would pay for. The fact is, President Trump has chosen to hold hostage critical services for the health, safety, and well-being of the American people and withhold the paychecks of 800,000 innocent workers across the nation, many of them veterans. He promised to keep government shut down for months or years, no matter whom it hurts. That's just plain wrong. The fact is, we all agree we need to secure our borders while honoring our values. We can build the infrastructure and roads at our ports of entry. We can install new technology to scan cars and trucks for drugs coming into our nation. We can hire the personnel we need to facilitate trade and immigration at the border. We can fund more innovation to detect unauthorized crossings. The fact is, the women and children at the border are not a security threat. They are a humanitarian challenge, a challenge that President Trump's own cruel and counterproductive policies have only deepened. And the fact is, President Trump must stop holding the American people hostage, must stop manufacturing a crisis, and must reopen the government. Thank you. Leader Schumer?
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi. My fellow Americans, we address you tonight for one reason only. The President of the United States, having failed to get Mexico to pay for his ineffective, unnecessary border wall, and unable to convince the Congress or the American people to foot the bill, has shut down the government. American democracy doesn't work that way. We don't govern by temper tantrum. No president should pound the table and demand he gets his way, or else the government shuts down, hurting millions of Americans who are treated as leverage. Tonight, and throughout this debate and throughout his presidency, President Trump has appealed to fear, not facts, division, not unity. Make no mistake, Democrats and the president both want stronger border security. However, we sharply disagree with the president about the most effective way to do it. So, how do we untangle this mess? Well, there's an obvious solution. Separate the shutdown from arguments over border security. There is bipartisan legislation supported by Democrats and Republicans to reopen government while allowing debate over border security to continue. There is no excuse for hurting millions of Americans over a policy difference. Federal workers are about to miss a paycheck. Some families can't get a mortgage to buy a new home. Farmers and small businesses won't get loans they desperately need. Most presidents have used Oval Office addresses for noble purposes. This president just used the backdrop of the Oval Office to manufacture a crisis, stoke fear, and divert attention from the turmoil in his administration. My fellow Americans, there is no challenge so great that our nation cannot rise to meet it. We can reopen the government and continue to work through disagreements over policy. We can secure our border without an ineffective, expensive wall. And we can welcome legal immigrants and refugees without compromising safety and security. The symbol of America should be the Statue of Liberty, not a 30-foot wall. So our suggestion is a simple one. Mr. President, reopen the government and we can work to resolve our differences over border security, but end this shutdown now. Thank you.
The Minority Leader and the Speaker of the House delivering their response to the first presidential address from the Oval Office, which immediately preceded that. Nancy Pelosi said the president is holding the American people hostage. Chuck Schumer said he is governing by temper tantrum and stoking fear. Ed O'Keefe is here on the set. Ed, I don't think I heard anything tonight to indicate we're any closer to a solution.
Not at all. Look, we heard from a president held in low regard by most Americans, touting a policy proposal held in low regard by most Americans. And tonight, based on what we just heard, is all about posturing. I heard nothing specific from either side on some kind of a compromise that could potentially break this logjam starting tomorrow. Part of the problem is that they can't agree on the facts. Now, we could spend hours going over the facts that are shared by either side, but we should call out some of them. The president tonight, for example, saying that 20,000 children were found crossing the border illegally last month. Not quite. According to the Customs and Border Protection, 4,982 unaccompanied minors were apprehended in October, about 5,200 in November, and family units is how Customs and Border Protection defines it, about 23,115. So he talks about children. In fact, it's members of families who cross the border. It's that kind of tweaking of facts that is aggravating Democrats and making it very difficult for them to come to some kind of agreement with the president.
The numbers are important. Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill. Nancy, tomorrow afternoon, do we have an indication that something might happen, that progress might be made? What happens tomorrow?
Well, here's what House Democrats are going to start doing, Jeff, and this is a tactic that Republicans know well because they tried it when they were in the minority in a similar situation. They're going to start holding votes on reopening these closed agencies one by one and basically daring Republicans to join them. They'll be able to make the case, look, we, Democrats, are trying to reopen government and Republicans are standing in the way. So it'll be very interesting to see how many Republicans they'll be able to pick off. The president is coming here to Capitol Hill to try to keep those losses to a minimum. But just tonight, Alaska Republican Lisa Murkowski became the third Republican senator to say, you know what, perhaps we should reopen the rest of the government while we continue to debate these serious issues. You have Republican senators who are up for re-election in 2 years, who are worried about what their constituents will think because they have federal workers and many other Americans who are being affected by this shutdown. And you have senators who are looking at seeing the writing on the wall and realizing that these two sides are so far apart and have made no progress towards meeting each other in the middle. So right now, it's very difficult to see what kind of solution could be negotiated.
Major, is there the possibility of a solution or an increased possibility of a solution by Friday, given that that is the first day that many of these Americans, the government workers, would not be getting paychecks?
There's no sign of it here, Jeff. The White House believes that it can not only hold Republicans or a sufficient number of Republicans in line, and that over time, and this is the White House theory, I'm not saying it's true, but it's the theory that White House advisors, starting with the president on down, believe, that this shutdown, the longer it goes, will pressure Democrats, not Republicans. What is that theory based on? An assumption the president has that he said many times out loud. Most federal workers, he believes, are Democrats. How he knows that, no one here at the White House can quite explain. But that he believes it is certain. And he believes those Democratic federal workers, he so calls them, will put pressure on Democratic members of the House and Senate. The House and Senate Democratic leaders I've talked to, or their aides, don't buy that at all. And based on the reaction you saw tonight from Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer, they appear unified and entrenched on their position.
Ed, go ahead. By Friday, I think by our math, it would become, after Friday, the longest government shutdown ever.
Yes, because the one in the 1990s lasted a little more than 20 days, and by Friday it will be. And today, at least at the Department of Homeland Security, was the day by which paychecks had to be processed. So at this point, there are at least a few thousand federal employees across the country who know for certain they will not be paid on Friday, even if for some reason there was a resolution tomorrow night. One of the things to keep in mind when it comes to talking about the federal workforce, 85% of federal employees work somewhere far outside Washington, D.C. They work in red districts, they work in blue districts. And to think that by the end of the week, members of both parties won't be hearing from them is silly. They will be. Large cities across the country are built around federal infrastructure, and this has a huge effect across the country.
They've made some maneuvers to make accommodations for some of these folks to get paid who wouldn't have, but that's not easy.
No, and it's funny. That's partly in response to what the House is starting to do now. You heard yesterday the Treasury Department is going to bring back some IRS personnel to start processing refunds because House Democrats are set to vote on legislation that would essentially reopen the Treasury Department. So the White House trying to get ahead of Congress through executive action and say, don't worry, we don't need you to do it. We'll do it ourselves. Similarly, there's some issues with food stamps. Today, the Agriculture Secretary was forced to come out and say, we've got enough to go through February. It's an issue if we get to March. But if we're still having this argument in March, that's quite a dispute.
Yes, I would say so. Let's listen to a little bit of what we just heard from the president.
Imagine if it was your child, your husband, or your wife whose life was so cruelly shattered and totally broken. To every member of Congress, pass a bill that ends this crisis. To every citizen, call Congress and tell them to finally, after all of these decades, secure our border. This is a choice between right and wrong, justice and injustice. This is about whether we fulfill our sacred duty to the American citizens we serve. When I took the oath of office, I swore to protect our country, and that is what I will always do. So help me God.
Okay, that's the president. That was toward the end of his speech as he made this appeal to families, saying, imagine if you were in this situation. We do have Maria Villarreal now. She is near the border tonight and watched with some other folks who watched in McAllen, Texas, where the president is planning to go still on Thursday, although I don't recall him mentioning that in the speech. Maria, what did folks think of it there?
My boss wouldn't be too happy. My boss wouldn't be too happy.
Well, you know, Jeff, as of right now, what you're really looking at is the idea that this is a fairly blue area. Okay, listen, I just was told right now that they have not elected a Republican person here in this area for over 100 years. So clearly this skews towards the Democrats. But as we listened in to the president's speech, talk to the people here, I think what is very clear is they do see and feel a need for border security here in the Rio Grande Valley. There is no doubt, I think, that everybody supports that. But what you're going to see is a big divisiveness between law enforcement, between elected officials. A lot of elected officials here, over a dozen different cities, have said that they will not support a border wall, but they will support border security. So clearly they feel they need funds here to continue to support the influx of migrants that is coming across the border. They need the money to continue to support law enforcement. But what we are hearing from people that just watched the president speak is that they want to see more support, more unity between the two different parties here. I think that there is a feeling that while, a few years ago when we had President Obama asking for money for border security, for a border wall, there was a lot of support there. But now that we have President Trump in office, that there's just not support for him as a person, not necessarily him as a Republican or him as the president of the United States. The one day between now and obviously President Trump's potential trip here to the Rio Grande Valley, is there still that one day? There is hope that there will be some sort of discussions between the two sides in the next 24 hours.
All right, Maria, thank you very much from McAllen, Texas. Nancy Cordes, when the sides were talking, was there any consensus about a potential number between 0 and 5.7 billion on how much they might possibly agree on, if at all?
Well, that was part of the problem. Democrats say that the number kept changing, that the vice president, for example, would float 2.5 billion, and then the president would say, no, he actually wants 5.7 billion. And then a day later, he would say, actually, he wants even more money for additional border security. That's the reason Democrats say they don't think that these negotiations are going anywhere. And beyond that, they believe that there's a tactical consideration here as well, that if they treat this like a normal negotiation and continue to work with the president, that this will only encourage him to use this kind of approach the next time that funding is on the line.
Okay. Nancy Cordes, thanks very much. Ed O'Keefe, quickly. Final thoughts.
We'll see how that meeting goes tomorrow, but there's really no sign of resolution. Vicente Gonzalez is the congressman for the area where Murray is. He told us a little while ago on CBSN he considers this a 4th century solution to a 21st century problem. And in a sign of how little engagement there is with Democrats, the White House hasn't even invited him to tag along on Thursday to his home district.
But you talk to some of the people, as Maria noted, in some of these, there is some nuance to some of these arguments that, unfortunately, at times, sometimes I think gets lost. Ed O'Keefe here on the set with us, Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill, Major Garrett at the White House, and also Maria Villarreal down on the border. We thank you all. For some of you in the West, the CBS Evening News is next. For most, CBS primetime programming follows. CBS News coverage continues on our 24-hour digital network, CBSN. I'll see you tomorrow. Until then, I'm Jeff Glor, CBS News in New York. Good night.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. In his first primetime address from the Oval Office, President Trump said there is a growing humanitarian and security crisis at the southern border. The president outlined proposals to increase security at the border, which he said include more Border Patrol agents, immigration judges, and once again reiterated his request for $5.7 billion for a barrier at the border. Mr. Trump also slammed Democrats over what he said was their, quote, refusal to acknowledge the crisis. He said the current government shutdown, which entered day 18 on Tuesday, was because Democrats would not fund border security.
How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job? To those who refuse to compromise in the name of border security, I would ask, imagine if it was your child, your husband, or your wife whose life was so cruelly shattered and totally broken. To every member of Congress, pass a bill that ends this crisis.
We can reopen the government and continue to work through disagreements over policy.
Nancy Pelosi said the president chose, quote, fear over facts, and said the president was holding critical services hostage by keeping the government shut down.
Sadly, much of what we heard from President Trump throughout this senseless shutdown has been full of misinformation and even malice. The president has chosen fear. We want to start with the facts. The fact is, on the very first day of this Congress, House Democrats passed Senate Republican legislation to reopen government and fund smart, effective border security solutions. But the president is rejecting these bipartisan bills, which would reopen government, over his obsession with forcing American taxpayers to waste billions of dollars on an expensive and ineffective wall.
Joining me now are Caitlin Huey-Burns, Leslie Sanchez, and Antoine Seawright. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. Leslie is a CBS News contributor and Republican strategist, and Antoine is the CEO and founder of Blueprint Strategy and was an advisor to the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. All right, so I want to start with the same question for all of you. What's your sort of takeaway from what we heard tonight?
Well, I think we had 15 minutes of primetime coverage that got us absolutely nowhere. You had the president speak and the leaders of the Democratic Party speak, and they both said exactly what they have been saying for the past 2 weeks, if not the past several months, and in the case of President Trump, the past several years. That speech, that address, very much reminded me of the speeches that he made on the campaign trail, particularly pointing to illegal immigration and what he calls a crisis at the border. So if I'm a federal worker, if I'm a federal employee who is on the threshold of not receiving a paycheck this weekend, I really wonder what we are getting out of leaders at this point if we're 2 weeks in and there has not been any movement towards a consensus.
Leslie, what about you?
On that point, for federal workers, I think it was very disheartening because normally there's some sense of movement and compromise, but you're getting a very clear, brisk, cold feeling that's coming in that this could go as long as the president is saying, that he is really playing a game of chicken here and going to see who is going to blink or jump first, and it's not going to be him. And I don't think we've never seen anything like that. So again, we're entering territory we just don't know. But what really I take away, the president's laying a case for a very serious humanitarian crisis on the border, talking about the victims who've lost their lives because of undocumented immigrants, but nowhere did he mention the 2 children that have died under custody, under U.S. care. And so there is a value to life that it should be consistent regardless, and those were children who passed away within the U.S. border. So there's a lot that's not connecting in his argument. But I will tell you, many of the base are going to hear the president standing strong. The president's committed to getting this done. And they're not going to get kind of lost in the details of percentages and numbers. Okay, it's his math versus. They don't have faith in the public system, in the Democrats, and they really don't want to get lost in the numbers. They want to see action on the wall.
Antoine, what did you hear tonight?
Par for the course. I said on many occasions, this president operates in a place of fear, anger, confusion, and frustration, and he governs by crisis. And we saw this tonight. What I heard from Schumer and Pelosi, it felt like they were watching this network because they repeated some of the many things I said, manufactured crisis, etc. The unfortunate thing, and take the partisan politics out of it, I did not see the posture of the president feel any type of way for the federal workers who were laid off. I mean, he rarely mentioned them. What I also did not hear from the president, you didn't hear much mention of the campaign rhetoric about the wall, the wall, the wall. He's now rehearsing the talking point of what 62% of the American people say they want, and that's border security. And guess what, Mr. President? That's what Democrats have been saying for a very long time. What you also heard from Schumer and Pelosi is that let's crawl before we walk. Let's reopen the government. Let's get the government open and let the legislative branch, House and the Senate, get together and send you something that we all can agree on. But what I was so glad to hear from my leader Pelosi, was the fact that, you know what, Democrats have passed multiple bills to reopen the government, including a bipartisan bill that passed the Senate before the holiday to reopen the government, negotiate in good faith. And you know what? Let's do what the legislative branch should do and keep the executive branch out of it. And I'm so proud of the Democrats. You know what? We are saying we are for opening the government, we're for border security, but we are waiting on you Republicans and you, Mr. President, to come to the table.
Leslie, I want to play some of what the president had to say about those most impacted by illegal immigration. Let's listen to that.
All Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal migration. It strains public resources and drives down jobs and wages. Among those hardest hit are African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War.
All right, so a lot to unpack there, but can we start with the beginning of that, where he talked about African Americans and Hispanics being harmed, but then didn't seem to go into any specifics. Have we heard that before? What might he been referencing there?
Every once in a while you hear an argument like that is basically saying the lowest paid workers are at risk with people that are paid even below them, under the table, or wages that are not.
That's his implication.
That's the implication, is that undocumented workers are taking away kind of those lower paying jobs. I think it's a false argument overall. You could also say undocumented workers are living in their neighborhoods because they're lower socioeconomic incomes, and you see multiple undocumented families living in one apartment house unit, so maybe there's more crime. But there's so many facts that can discount that, and there's so much to unpack, and it really is, Elaine, about legal versus illegal immigration. It's about what is this whole argument about? Is this really about border security and protect, or is this really we have a problem with the U.S., the southern border of the United States, and the flow of people that are coming into this country who are taking American jobs, putting pressure on our school systems, our healthcare systems. It's costing us a lot of money. And until we get control, we can put all the border security, enforcement, technology, infrastructure on the border. Until you match that with getting control of the labor and the drug demand of the United States and match that up properly, you're never going to be able to have a solution to the problem.
So one of the, I know you want to jump in here, Antoine, but before we continue, I think one of the challenges here is because there are so many claims being made. I mean, my inbox right now is exploding with fact check kind of claims and checks that, you don't even know where to start here. But, Antoine, I wonder, did you feel that there was perhaps anything different about the tone from what we heard with the president there, where it was more of sort of this sort of storytelling kind of approach, something that we have heard before, starting with even the president's acceptance speech, I think, at the convention, where he talked about the fact that, in his view, undocumented immigrants are there are criminal elements that are causing harm to Americans. I mean, that seemed to be a theme that he tried to hit there, but in perhaps a softer way. Is that fair to say?
Red meat, right-wing, toned-down rhetoric, fear, anger, confusion, frustration, governed by crisis. What I heard tonight was the president rehearse, essentially, what we've seen and heard on some of the right-wing networks and then the right-wing media. He added the story about the officer who was killed, and Lord knows my heart goes out to the officer and his family and those impacted. But that was an emotional part to tear on the hearts and minds of his base. What I think get lost in all this, and take the partisan politics out of this, these mothers who are walking with their children thousands of miles, they're not coming here to do what the president somehow tries to relate to the American people. They're coming because they want a better quality of life. They want to experience this thing called the American franchise. And so sometimes that gets lost in it because of the politics. But my heart is a little soft. If a mother is willing to travel 2,000 miles with her children or her child to try to seek a better quality of life, you know what? Let's figure out a system. Let's fix a broken system that will allow them to do that in a very legal way. And I think that gets lost in all of this. Everyone is not a rapist or a thug or a killer. Everyone's not peddling drugs. These people really want a better quality of life.
Well, I think it goes back to the president's original campaign in 2016 when he's talking about the racist, rapist, and kind of the worst, lowest common denominator of kind of race baiting in many ways that the president went to, and it's fascinating. Kind of, and Antoine made me think about that. Not only in that language, but the harm that they're bringing. But who is he sympathetic to? He's sympathetic. He's choosing who he's sympathetic to. And even if you tether that to his other argument he'd be making earlier in the week about so many individuals come from foreign countries, get educated at our Ivy League institutions, our tech schools, and then they can't stay because they don't have the proper visa. We want them, but we don't want them. So he's not saying, I have compassion for these families that are coming here. Why don't we bolster their economies, see what we can do to negotiate bilateral agreements so people can stay in their countries and want to work? No, he's not talking about that aspect. He's saying, let's kind of slow that gateway. But the truth is, there are already smuggling routes that are tunnels. There are already routes that, if there will be a way, whether it's under or over the Rio Grande, when it comes to the southern border, that's already existing. This is a billion-dollar, in many cases, operation when you talk about human trafficking and drugs.
So on that point of smuggling, Caitlin, the president said that 20,000 illegal children were brought across the border last month. Now, according to Customs and Border Protection, 4,982 unaccompanied minors were apprehended in October of 2018 and 5,283 in November of 2018. So, I mean, what is the president's strategy here in raising sort of this specter of 20,000 illegal children being brought across the border?
Well, I think he is trying to respond to all of the criticism, much of it rightly so, to his border policy and the separation of children that received bipartisan backlash last year. He has been trying to make this argument over the course of the past several months that, look, I do care about children and they are being manipulated, are his terms. So it's a way for him, at least rhetorically, to kind of broaden out the victims of what he calls this. And so it's certainly part of the strategy, but again, easily able to be fact-checked. And again, illegal crossings have been down, have been decreasing steadily over the past several years. And the president, I think, benefits, he believes, politically, he believes, by having different kinds of people pit against each other. And we saw this in the campaign, and we also have to kind of take a step back and think of the political context that we're operating in. First, last week, a new Congress was sworn in. We're in divided government. The president knows that he doesn't have the Republican support that he used to have when Republicans controlled all of Washington. Second, I know we're in 2019, but we're very much getting into these 2020 campaigns. You already have Democrats out there running for president, and there is this sense that among Republicans and the president that they really need to dig in their heels and fight the fights to able to galvanize their base of support ahead of what is expected to be a very difficult re-election battle. Now, that didn't work on the House side. This kind of rhetoric didn't work on the House side, at least in 2018. You did, however, have several Republicans running for the Senate who did endear themselves to the president and did sign on to a lot of his policies. So there is kind of a mixed bag there.
So the president also presented several numbers regarding drugs. He said more Americans will die this year from opioids than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. And our fact checkers say that that's true. He also said 90% of heroin comes across the border, and our research shows that number to be less certain. But Leslie, is that perhaps a new strategy here to kind of focus the conversation a bit more on these deaths due to drugs? I mean, it's something we heard him talk about from the outset, but now he's sort of trying to drill down on some numbers here, perhaps.
No, I think so. What's different? It's almost the Trump message 2.0. The difference is if there can be a softer side. You're talking about the storytelling. What he's doing is he's weaving in the examples that you hear in the news every day, and the opioid crisis is very real. Right. And it's interesting, especially when I talk about a lot about the heartland of America or the Rust Belt states, people that have really experienced that. That is very true in terms of how that's happening. So people will say, I agree with that part. But the heroin part is interesting because a lot of that comes from different legal points of entry. Right. So it gets mixed in. But I think if you went back and like the focus groups that we're doing and you talk to the voters, the bigger takeaway, they're looking at the bigger takeaway. The president is finally doing something about it's perceived as this just open flow. So if you take it to the simplest context, the Republicans are for securing, the Democrats are for open borders, moving all sorts of illegal and illegal contraband across the border. And as long as they remain steadfast in not allowing the president to secure it, the president is winning. And this is, I believe, where the Republicans are going to fall. Whether you agree with it or not, and it's very draconian in the sense of the approach, but that nobody's going to look back at this closure and say, oh, you know, it was good or bad. They're going to say, was something done?
It's interesting, though, because you have, you know, Antoine, I was watching you when Nancy Cortez was reporting about Lisa Murkowski now being the third Republican senator to say, well, you know what, maybe we should go ahead and reopen the government while we debate these things. So perhaps some movement there, at least.
My conversations with Republicans on the Hill, elected leaders and staff, is that, you know what, we cannot afford the political pressure and the risk the calculation of losing the Senate because Trump is playing games with his campaign promise. We're going to separate the two, and we'll run on our record as senators and let him run on his record as president. So again, I'll say what I said earlier. You're going to see senators fall off one by one to say, you know what, we passed this bill right before Christmas. It was bipartisan. It will reopen the government and let us do what we've been elected to do and renegotiate in good faith. What we heard from the president tonight was talking points and buzzwords: opioids, African Americans, Mexicans. He speaks in buzzwords, he speaks in talking points, and that's how he was able to penetrate a group of people who've never been tapped before, who have not been tapped in a long time. They're not interested in what the fact checkers are saying. You know why? Because this administration, this president has done a wonderful job, because he's a public relations master and a public relations puppet, of pushing back on everything the media says. So it's the fake media, the fake news. So when you and I talk about disputing these numbers, you know what he's going to say, his administration? That's not true. That's just, the fake news. That's the fake media.
And Major Garrett did ask the vice president about why not separate these out. He really didn't have a good answer. But that public pressure campaign is what I'm going to be watching, particularly among those Republican senators who are up for re-election again in 2020 from a very different map, from either swing states or even blue states. What they start to feel now that it comes to paychecks and actual money in people's pockets, what that looks like and if that's effective.
All right. Caitlin Huey-Burns, Leslie Sanchez, and Antoine Seawright, thank you so much. Coming up after a quick break, after President Trump's Oval Office address, we get a look at how people across the country feel about immigration, the border, and a wall. From CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. You're streaming CBS News, always on. The president made his case for border wall funding Tuesday evening, with Democrats swiftly rebutting. However, we wondered what Americans think of his proposal. To answer this question, let's bring in Anthony Salvanto. He's CBS News' Director of Elections and Surveys. Anthony, give us some context here. Where do people stand on this issue of the wall and whether or not it's worth a shutdown?
Right. And let's be clear. We're talking about what we know heading into this speech.
That's right.
In subsequent days, we'll be polling. I'm sure a lot of people will be polling to see whether this changed any minds or what people think of the shutdown. Now, what we do know coming into this is that there's been a very consistent number of people who favor the wall. They are predominantly Republicans. Most Republicans do favor it. They make up about a third, in our most recent poll, 38% of the country. And that line's been really flat, like I say, going all the way back to the start of the Trump administration. Meanwhile, Americans overall, you break out the Republicans from, say, Democrats and independents, and you get much lower numbers of favorability on the wall. So the difference here, Elaine, is A, would this change any minds? Well, historically, nothing's changed any minds yet. And B, then you see it's not just about the numbers who support it. It's also about the intensity of preference, of what you'll do to get the wall. And we do know that people who favor it also tend to favor shutting down the government in order to get it.
Does it matter what you call it? If it's a wall, if it's a barrier, is there a way to tell?
Well, that's a great question, and I very well may test that in the coming days. But I think what we know so far is that the idea of a wall goes as much to the principle as it does to the particular barrier, by which I mean people talk often in the polls about the kinds of people that they feel are trying to come across the border and whether immigrants contribute to society or detract from it. And we see big partisan splits, and we have leading up to this and into the midterms on those views, where Republicans tend to say that, migrants tend to be a threat to the United States, often contain, if not most, some they describe as criminals, whereas Democrats more likely to tell us in the polling that they feel that most people are people looking for work or looking for humanitarian assistance. Once you get past that conception of who this is trying to cross, that, it appears, at least in the polling, stands out as determinative of what you think ought to be done, perhaps any more so than what shape the wall takes.
Sure, if you're fearful of those who might be coming across, that would seem to determine your posture towards whatever policy the president puts forward. So I'm wondering, this is an issue that you've looked at for a long time here. And, President Trump, you've polled on this issue of a wall. President Trump has really remained consistent here in terms of his message from the very beginning, in the outset, even at the start of his candidacy. Have you found this to be, in your polling, something that the president must absolutely come through on in order to maintain his base when you look at that Republican support?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of data points to look at there. The first is that when you look at people who voted in the midterms, what they thought about the president's approach to immigration up to that point, you saw Republicans saying that it had been about right or even not tough enough. And it's a third of people who voted for Republicans in Congress, the folks who are at this point standing behind the president on this, saying it's not tough enough. So that speaks to this idea that he does have that base that's behind him, and then that dramatic difference with Democrats saying that it had been, in fact, too tough. And the other big data point, I say, is in the exit polls, we saw that people who voted for Democrats were most concerned about issues like health care. Well, we're obviously not talking about things like health care right now. So in the sense that this could have an effect of putting this issue or keeping this issue front and center, that's clearly something that might play towards that Republican base, because they did pick immigration as, among others, their most important issue when they were voting for Republicans in the midterm. So it somewhat depends on what you wanted your Congress to do as you were casting that ballot.
So leading up to this point, is this an issue, Anthony, where there has been a lot of movement in the past when it comes to, various proposals being put forward? And if so, or if not, what does that suggest about what we might see after you do all your polling after tonight?
Well, one element of this is that there may not be surprise among people, even those who support the wall, that there's a fight over how to pay for it. Because even though we saw Republicans supporting the wall, many, when we started at the start of the president's term, did you expect Mexico to pay or do you expect the U.S. to pay? Even though supporters said they ultimately expected the U.S. to have to pay. So that's one thing where you say, well, this fight or this attempt to get funding may not be a surprise. Now, of course, it's been 2 years, so they've had a while to get to this point. We'll certainly poll on whether that surprise has sort of resurfaced. But I think the other point here is whether or not people start to prioritize this, whether they call it a crisis now, to use that language that the president has described, because again, sometimes it's not what you want done about an issue, it's how important and how salient you think it is, regardless of how you feel.
So do you think there will be movement after this speech?
I think the thing we're going to test is whether or not people see this as of urgent importance. And that, I think, remains an open question. I think it's probably the question. If people don't feel that this is important enough to shut down the government, then you start to see the political ramifications of leaving it shut down. Having said all that, I look back to polling in, say, the last shutdown, in say, 2013, where more people at the time blamed Republicans for the shutdown than Democrats, and yet the political ramifications in the subsequent midterms, the Republicans did well, and of course, years later won the presidency.
Right.
So then the question becomes, how long does any political ramification last?
Right.
And that, well, the way politics moves now, it's...
I know, it's a lightning pace, right?
It could be,
lightning speed.
2 hours.
Exactly. All right, Anthony Salvanto, always great to see you. Thank you so much, Anthony. President Trump frequently refers to what's happening at our border with Mexico as a crisis. We are going to take a quick break. We'll have much more for you coming up. Stay with us. You're streaming CBSN.